The first question, of course, which arises with Stirling is how to speak about an architect who probably is one of the best known architects of the 20th century. We know that he was born in 1924. We even know that he was conceived on a ship nearby New York in 1923. We know his passion for ornithology. We know that he had a military education, that he fought in the Second World War as a parachutist over Normandy. We know that he was educated as an architect in Liverpool. We know that he discovered very early the œuvre complète of Le Corbusier. We know where he worked in London, with whom he worked in London. We know that he was member of the avant-garde in London, exhibiting with the most promising young architects in the 50s in London. We know that he was member of the Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne, which was a kind of key organization of the modern movement. We know that he had a professional activity over 40 years till his death, 1992. And of course, we know that he was the third Pritzker Prize. So what can we say somehow about somebody who is so well researched? His buildings have been discussed and published first by him, who during his own career would publish in the same format as Le Corbusier his own work, but also architectural journal, newspaper, surveys on 20th century architecture mention his from his earliest projects, his diploma project, up to his housing project, to his university buildings of the 60s, up to his competition entries of the 70s, of the 80s, and even for the individual buildings. If you look in the library catalog for the individual buildings, we will see that on each building there have been monographs published. So on his university building, Leicester, 1 monograph. Of his museum in Stuttgart, even 4 monographs. So how should I somehow this evening bring something new into the room? How should I bring a new interpretation, a new perspective of James Stirling? And of course, as he was widely published, his work has been classified. And I just want to show you different modes of classification of his work. A first one would be a kind of stylistic or chronological one. So it would begin with a kind of Corbusian phase, like in his thesis project, followed up by a kind of new brutalist phase, where he would use material in their rough expression. From then on, we would have a kind of constructivist phase relating to the early Russian production. From there on, a kind of pop phase relating to the Olivetti design in the late 60s by Sotsas, and which is reflected in the training center James Stirling will build for Olivetti in Great Britain. Then we would have a kind of postmodern phase where somehow, depending on how we define postmodernity, be it this kind of centrality of the axis, a kind of classic, returning to classical town planning, or if we define postmodernism as urban contextuality, or if we define postmodernism through its motive, like here's a repetition of a Palladian villa, through a kind of similar formal language, or if we define postmodernism as a commodification in art and architecture, which you can see probably best in James Stirling's latest project, his museum project in Germany. So a first classification of his work would be a chronological one through different styles, from the modernist to the new brutalist to the pop phase up to a postmodern phase. A second way of classification which has been done would be a classification by the partner. Probably you know that James Stirling didn't work alone, but that he had through his career different partners. So we would have a first phase with James Gowan, a second phase when the young Leon Krier used to work in his office, then a third phase with Michael Wilford, and a fourth phase with his German partner for the German project. So a stylistic division, a chronological division, or a formal classification. It would be a third way of understanding Stirling, and this has been done on different buildings. I just want to show two buildings. For instance, if we read the Leicester building, which you can see here on the right for you, this building has been compared through its functional expression and the functional expression of the brick volumes to Alvar Aalto's Baker dormitory. It has also been compared to the Johnson Wax Company through the ribbon windows, compared to Melnikov, of course, through its volumetry, especially the volumetry of the main auditorium. The massivity has been compared to topographical formation. Its filigranity has been compared to British or English Gothic architecture, or to its composition of volumes to castles, or his wide use of glass to Kew Gardens. So there would be another reading, not through styles, not through persons, but somehow through different references which appears throughout his work. And you can do this for the early phase, and you could do this, and it has been done also for the later phase. So for instance, you would compare the geometry of the Stuttgart Museum with its circular central court and its rectangular succession of exhibition space. It has been compared to the Mausoleum of Augustus. It has been compared to Boulet's project for a museum. It has been compared to Schinkel, of course, where the combination of circle and rectangular has been used. It has been compared to Gunnar Asplund's library. And Stirling himself would do a similar work with references. He would, even in his lecture, show a kind of analog approach to architecture, comparing his university building to an engine, so stressing the mechanistic approach of his buildings. He would compare his school to a castle ruined thanks to this wall which is built around. He would compare the verticality of Leicester with Hawkmoor's churches. He would compare the courtyard in his Oxford building to a cloister garden, etc. So somehow we see that the work of Stirling has been analyzed through different systems of order, which helps to distinguish an early phase and a late phase in building which have been built in different collaboration, building which belongs more to a late modern phase or to a postmodern phase. But the question which arises, but what do we learn about Stirling through this reading? What do we learn aside a kind of formal history? What do we learn aside a biographical history of these architects? And then the second question would be, what distinguishes Stirling from other architects? Every architect somehow works with references. Every architect has different phases. Every architect's work somehow can be distinguished thanks to the person he was working with. And then the third question would be, what distinguishes Stirling from other times, from architects from other times? And then from this on, what can we learn from Stirling about the second half of the 20th century? And what can we learn from Stirling in general about architecture? This is somehow the question or the thing I would like you to propose today, to propose another reading of Stirling, and I hope that through this other reading we somehow can grasp some aspect of architecture which are very and still very relevant for our today's understanding of his work. And the proposal I would like to do today is to focus not on a biographical reading, not so much on a formal reading, but on one specific technique or tool of representation, which is the arrow. This seems for me a special feature in the work of Stirling throughout his life, from the beginning up to the end. And the hypothesis which I would like to have today is this is not only a new form of representation, but that this new form of representation also is an expression of a new approach in architectural design, and from this perspective that the arrow is somehow a symbolic form out of which we can learn a lot about a certain way of thinking and doing architecture. My lecture will be divided today in two sections. In the first part, I want to show the different arrows in the work of Stirling, so just do a broad overview of the corpus I have. In the second part, I would like to understand where does the arrow come from, and in the third part, show then the meaning between the signification of the arrow in architecture. This is for the first part. So the arrow, its prehistory, and its meaning and signification for the architecture in Stirling's work. And in the second part of my lecture, I would like to focus on another tool of representation, the axonometry, which replaces at a certain point in the work of, or in the representation of the work of Stirling, the arrow. And here too, I would like to show first this use of axonometry in the work of Stirling, then in a second part do a short history of the axonometry, and then to conclude show the meaning or the signification for this tool of representation in the architecture of Stirling. Of course, there are a lot of well-known arrows in the work of Stirling. For instance, arrows indicating the direction of stairs, or arrows showing the movement of a window, which you can see here, or arrows showing the north. So these are somehow quite well-known arrows. But there are also arrows showing construction process, arrows showing the movement of people by car or by foot, or arrows showing also the movement of things, or liquids, or sun arrows. There are arrows showing movement of air, arrows showing the sun rays, arrows showing the gaze, the movement of the eyes to control or to enjoy something. Then there are arrows like here, arrows to enjoy the view, arrows which show structural forces, arrows which show the direction of a visit, and arrows which show the movement of vehicles like this boat in the Tate Gallery in London. Perhaps it seems obvious for you to speak about arrows. Arrows for you perhaps being not something so new, but if you look back into the books Stirling would read, for instance, in Le Corbusier's complete work, you wouldn't find so much arrows. There are a few exceptions. In the Mondaneum or in the Soviet Palace, there are some arrows. But mostly, the books are lacking arrows. Or Alvar Aalto's design, which were also on the drawing board of this young generation, don't show arrow at all. Where does the arrow come from, then? The first arrow I could find is in a hydraulic treaty from the 18th century, where it is a sign for the movement of water. And similar arrows you find also some years later in the Encyclopédie from Diderot and d'Alembert, where the direction of the Seine river is shown through arrows. Here the arrow represents movement in a static drawing. So the focus is not so much anymore on the buildings, but is on the movement in time and space, on the motion of fluids, things, gases, people, and later energy and information. In the 19th century, you will not find the arrows so much in architectural books, but much more in treatises of scientists or engineers, like this House of Two Doctors, Drysdale and Hayward, which shows the movement of heating in a house. So through the introduction of new appliances and new necessities of comfort, the engineers will somehow use the arrow to show the performance of the air throughout the building. Especially this building is very nice, as you can see how the air enters through the basement, is heated, and then goes up in the room and goes down again a fall shaft, and through a fire is then expelled throughout the chimney. So here for the first time we see how the scientists who know how air functions and know how air goes through a building use the arrow somehow to plan it. So describing something is knowing something and allows somehow also to design something, which is particularly true in this heating system, which brings air in and through the house again up and outside. Of course, in the 20th century, arrows are beginning to be used in these studies in home management, where Christine Frederick shows how you should arrange in an economical way your kitchen. So here the arrows begins to show a performance inside a building, the shortest and more efficient way of using somehow a ground plan. The architects would begin to integrate them, like Bruno Taut in his own house, but these would be books which would be not known so much at the time. And even when historians like Siegfried Gideon would write a book on mechanization, so mechanization is all about performance in architecture, it's all about movement in architecture, they wouldn't use so much drawing which uses the arrow. So the question arises, what does the arrow mean in the work of James Stirling? Where does it come from? It's difficult to know exactly if Stirling was aware of all the history of the arrow I've been showing. No, as I showed it, it was not so much widespread in the architectural literature of the time. He may have known some of the studies, or he may have known the interests of his fellow historian Ray Benham, who from the 60s on would devote a whole research on the question of the well-tempered environment and where one would find a series of arrows. And perhaps he would be aware of this house of these two doctors, which was still standing in Liverpool. Interestingly enough, in the same year when Rainer Benham publishes this study where he writes about the climate in its historical perspective, James Stirling would himself begin to build, would inaugurate this building, which you can see here, and which can be considered somehow the application of the theoretical knowledge that Benham would develop out of his interest in the well-tempered environment. What Benham does in a historical perspective, studying the heating systems in the 19th century, James Stirling would try to apply in his own buildings. As you can see, the library in Cambridge can be considered somehow as research on the well-tempered indoor climate with floor heatings, with heating panels, with blowing systems of warm air throughout the buildings, but also with this membrane of two glass sheets which would allow to bring the light in and to bring out the excessive heat through a ventilation system. What we see here is the wish of Stirling somehow to develop an architecture as a well-tempered environment. But this building is not only a well-tempered climatic environment, but it's also a well-controlled visual and functional environment, as one can see through other drawings of these buildings. For instance, when you look at the gaze of the librarian who is standing here in the middle of the building and who can control from his desk visually the bookshelves and the reading room, which is here. But from his desk, he can also control the temperature and the light of the building. So we have here a kind of panopticon which does not only deal with the gaze, but which deals also with the climatic control. A similar perspective is visible here on the upper floors, from where you can also see inside this main hall. So Cambridge is, of course, a well-tempered environment, but it's also a visually controlled environment, and it's also, here's the view of the librarian, but it's also an environment which controls precisely the circulation of the inside the buildings, as you can see here, through the main entrances and to the upper floor where less people are accessing the building. The arrow is smaller, so somehow the building is also in its shape and its circulation system somehow an expression of a well-controlled circulation throughout the building, a circulation which, as I've said, decreases from floor to floor when we climb the building. And what is true for Cambridge can also be seen for other buildings, Leicester, for instance, which can be considered as a device for controlling movement of persons, as I already said, by foot, by car, inside the building, outside the building, the services on the back side of the building, but also the sun rays on the main workshops, as you can see here. So Leicester is a device for distribution, one could say. St. Andrews, the student residences, the individual, the disposition of the building could be considered as a visual device in which every room has a completely free view on the environment, or Stuttgart as a device of artistic consumption, where somehow the viewer is guided through the building in a kind of meandric way throughout the buildings, through a parcours which is precisely designed and viewed by James Stirling. So here somehow we have different forms. Here the arrows in all these buildings show different forms of performances and regulation, climatic and visual in Cambridge, infrastructure in Leicester, visual in Stuttgart, and also visual in St. Andrews. The arrows allows us to show here a new conception or a new description of architecture, where architecture is not anymore conceived just as a form, as a problem of construction, as an act of building, but where architecture is conceived as a machine or a device which supports human activities through its design. Designing in this building is somehow controlling its environment, be it natural or artificial. What is at stake here is, of course, the form, but not only the form and its shape, but also the conditions which shape this form. What is at stake are not only the geometrical relation, but also the topological ones. To better explain this, I would quickly like to make an excursus on one exhibition project of James Stirling, which can seem at first very strange and difficult to grasp when we see his building. What is it? It's a plastic or a sculpture which he did with two colleagues for an exhibition. This is Tomorrow, which was shown 1956 in the Whitechapel Gallery, where also the Smithsons and others were exhibiting at that time. And what is this? It's simply a plastic representation of a soap bubble, as you can see here. And what is the problem of a soap bubble? That a soap bubble is something which changes all the time. So from the moment you try to grasp it, with a little breeze of wind, it already has changed his form. So the only way somehow of describing this, it's in describing its topological relation. So you can only describe through time the relation of the different points which you see here, but it's very difficult somehow to describe it as something geometrical, because these relations change all the time when some wind or other forces move it. What we can see here is an interest of a design process and an interest to try to grasp and to design and to represent somehow the forces which shape a building. This can be best described, for instance, if you look at the sketches of the Queen's College in Oxford, one of the important university building by James Stirling. If you follow the design process. You see that the building consisted of two bars, which you find in all the different sketches, and how this bar will be slightly and slowly deformed to adapt first, of course, to the complicated site, but also to adapt to the visual and natural situation of this building, having on its north side a river and a big park looking down to the city of Oxford. So a slow a transformation of the two bars into a regular shape, which will also be transformed in its third dimension by the need of bringing in light into the building. This is the reason why these different stories are somehow stepped as they are. So here you see how this interest to represent somehow the forces or the movement which shapes a building are becoming a design instrument inside the work of James Stirling. And in the same way, we could understand the transformation of these two bars into this half-circled building in Oxford. We could also understand somehow the big glass roof in Cambridge, somehow as a result of the panoptic gaze, of the downward gaze, but also of the circulation of air, which goes up from the bottom to the ceiling of the building. And we could also understand somehow the transformation of the staircase in the University of Leicester as an expression of the decreasing number of persons going up by the staircase from floor to floor in this university building. And in the same way, somehow we could also understand the late buildings where the stair ramps, escalators, and chimneys are represented in a very strong way, showing this interest of Stirling for the movement. And what are the consequences for architecture? Arrows are an expression of a new spatial approach where architecture is not anymore only conceived as a definition of boundaries, but much more as a conception of transparencies. Literal transparencies through space and materials, as we can see here in the History Faculty building in Cambridge, where the whole glass allows inside and outside exchange, or like in at the University of Leicester, or even in this gallery in the urban center of Derby, where the boundaries between private and public, between inside and outside, are blurred. A literal transparency, as has been described by Colin Rowe, but also a spatial transparency by overlapping, superposing, interlocking of different programs, elements, and spaces, as for instance in the Queen's College in Oxford, where the staircase and the facade geometry somehow interlock in this strange superposition of a vertical geometry for the staircases and biased geometry for the facade. Interlocking of different staircases, as in the case of the University of Leicester, or finally a sequence of different spaces, as in the History Faculty building in Cambridge, or as in the museum in Düsseldorf, a sequence, a representation of a sequence of pathways into and through the museum. Probably you have seen that I introduced a slow shift from representation of arrows now to representation of buildings in an axonometric way. And indeed, in the publications of James Stirling, the arrow is a representation technique which you see mostly in the early project, whereas around 1970s, the arrows are replaced by another form of representation, which is, as I said, the axonometry. Of course, the arrow doesn't disappear. If you look at some sketches of the late work, as here in the 80s, you still see some arrows of the sun and of the gazes, which crosses the buildings, also in the museum project. But the favorite way of representation is now the axonometry, and a very special way of axonometric representation, the axonometry from below, way of representing, which was known for the first time in the work of a great French historian, Auguste Choisy, who used this as a preferred way of representing his building. And here again, the shift is not so easy. If I say that the arrow continues in the late work, I can also show how the axonometry was also present in the early works of Stirling, as I already show it in the Project for a Village in 1955. We find it in the Ham Commons, which are also shown in axonometrical view. We know it also from different house studies from the 1950s. And of course, there are some precedences on which Stirling could rely. Of course, Asplund, I continue to show. Of course, Asplund would be one references which was for sure known by Stirling and his fellows. Or of course, Sartoris, who used the same technique of representation here for this urban study for a neighborhood, where through his gray shadows, he finds a way of representing an axonometry without having this reversal one can have with the axonometry. What does it mean, the axonometry? Why should an architect use the axonometry? And what could we learn for the work of Stirling? I would just want to go here also back into history and show three moments where the classical tools of representations, elevation, plan, and perspective or sectional drawing were replaced by the axonometry, where the axonometry brought in a new dimension into ways of representing in the work of, in the history of architecture. A first appearance, of course, is in the 17th century in military architecture, whereas axonometry is used for very simple reasons. Axonometry facilitates the way of calculating because the distances are not changed. So you can use directly this plan if you want to have measures. With a perspective, you have always a shortening, so it's very difficult to know the exact measurements which you have to know for a military building throughout perspective, whereas axonometry allows you to precisely avoid shortening, facilitating calculation, and what is more important, also avoiding blind spots, because also in the perspective you have only one view. The axonometry allows you somehow to see the building also in its blind spots or in its spots which have been concealed, would have been concealed through a perspective view. A second important use of the perspective is mechanical engineering, as you can see here in this very nice grinding engine model, a model for polishing glass, where thanks to the axonometry, you can exactly follow how the thing works, because you can see how the different elements of this device work one to each other. So the axonometry allows you somehow to show where the movement comes from, how it's transmitted throughout the machine, and how it's finally used to polish glass in the upper part of this representation. So here's the machine is not only something which allows or facilitates calculation, it's also a way of representing the transmission mechanism, or how the different parts of a machine or a building work together. And a third moment which one should probably mention, especially in the case of James Stirling, as I said, he was in the army, are of course the military manuals of the Second World War, where this kind of representation is also very much used. So if you have to build a shelter, for instance, one drawings allows you somehow to show how the parts fit together. Or if you have to know how to put together your gun, somehow, thanks to the axonometry, you can much better understand it as you would, for instance, through a section, plan, and elevation. So here we are. What are the characteristics then of the axonometry in the work of James Stirling? First is the possibility of representing different documents in one. Here in this drawing you have a section, you have a plan and elevation, which allows you to understand how the different parts of the building works, how this balustrade is fixed on the floor, and of course how the floor works together with the wall. And if you know a little bit about the English weather and about construction, you would see that here there is a problem, right? If you go directly like this, you will see that probably the water later or earlier will go down here, which of course would happen. You would also see that probably here there is also a problem in this joint. But anyway, you can see somehow how these different elements fit together in one plan. So the ability to represent all parts in one document. But a second way, it allows you also to represent a building in its construction process, as for instance here in this representation technique of the student residences in St. Andrews, where the crane somehow symbolizes as a construction process, which you can see here from the basement up to the finished building. So it allows you to represent architecture in time. An axonometry allows you not only to represent all elements in one drawing, it doesn't help you only to represent the temporality of construction, but it allows you also to represent a temporality in perception. If you go through this drawing, you will see that there are two ways, and I want to go quickly with you these two ways. From the porticos, you can either enter the building, then from there on take the ramp up to the upper floor. This is one way of visiting and seeing this building. But you can also, from these porticos, go the other way around the wall, enter the courtyard, and from the courtyard again leave the building and enter the city of Düsseldorf. Here we have two passes which are represented, an interior path with a pavilion, porch, and door ramp, an exterior path with a pavilion, the wall, the courtyard, and the city. What the axonometry allows here is to represent the different sequences of a path through a building. Somehow here, all the viewpoints, the different viewpoints you would have in a series of perspectival drawings are somehow brought into one singular drawing, which allows you to represent this different point of view. So it's not by chance if in the work of Stirling we see this kind of drawings. For instance, the axonometry here of the staircase, which is then again represented here in a sequence of photograph. Or if in Stuttgart, a very late project, the axonometrical drawings correspond somehow to the succession of viewpoints in the photos. In this project, somehow, we need 6 photos to show the spatial sequence of this building, of this drawing here. To conclude, what does the axonometry allow us? The axonometry allows us to conceive the building as a whole, not separated in several entities through plan, section, and elevation. The axonometry is an apt tool to represent the different movements in a building of fluids, but also of energies, and in the later project, especially of persons. It allows you to represent, but it allows you also to plan movement in the building, to plan its performance, and to plan how it is then performed. So the arrow and the axonometry are no rupture in the work of Stirling, but I would either argue but different moments in his work, from a more functional understanding in the early projects where the arrow is directional, even deterministic, up to a more visual understanding of the building, where, as in this drawing, somehow the arrow is not anymore unidirectional, but is much more a kind of possible path you can do through the buildings. This is particularly visible here in these two buildings, where somehow the path is here a straight one for the sun, for the people, for the cars, for the delivery. But whereas in the later building, as in the Staatsgalerie in Stuttgart, somehow you have a meandric approach to the building. So, possibility to represent the performance of a building, then a distinction between a first phase where the arrow is directional, even deterministic, up to a second phase where it becomes more multidirectional. Whereas in the first building, the building is represented with its function. In the late building, it's the viewer and his perception which are at stake in this building. This reading of the work through this reading of the work of James Stirling throughout the arrow and the axonometry allows us to revisit as a classical reading of James Stirling's work. Of course, the references are important, and of course there is a change in the references from a more machinic aesthetic up to a more classical aesthetic in the later project. But what is interesting with these references is not so much their significance, but the potential which is shown throughout this comparison. If Sterling brings together the Kew Garden, Palm House, and Leicester, it's for the potential of the transparency of glass. If he brings together the circle of Schinkel Altes Museum and his own circle, is for the potential the circle has as a circulation or organizational device in his work. So the history, I would argue, is more a source of potential than it is of form. And finally, this reading allows us to have a longer perspective throughout the history of the 20th century. Indeed, the interest for the performance and for arrows is not only visible in the work of James Sterling, we can see it also in the traffic studies, for instance, of Allison and Peter Smithson. You can see here a series of arrows in planning the city of London. You can see a similar approach where the knoll areas are shown here through arrows. So from a more perhaps social or perceptual approach to architecture up to a more infrastructural understanding in the work of Dennis Lasdun. But this interest in performance does not only concern Sterling, it does not concern only British architecture, but of course it has a much more wider, it represents a much more wider interest when Buckminster Fuller represents movements of air, or Louis Kahn as a traffic inside the city. But the topic which I have touched through the arrow does not only concern Sterling, does not only concern his friends in England, does not only concern his contemporary, but I would argue is much more a central topic of modernity. It's somehow an expression of an introduction of specialized knowledge in architecture throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, where physicians, pedagogues, physicists, chemists, administrators, and specialists of sustainability ask for certain performance in architecture. This growing importance of the specialized interest is somehow expressed in a necessity of the building and the claim of the building to be performative. But that this field should not be left to technicians, should be left to pedagogues, physicians, administrators, but can be used as a precise design tool, I think has brilliantly been showed and acknowledged by James Sterling. This is somehow what I tried to show you today, from a representation technique up to a symbolic form. Thank you very much.